First up, I want to go on the record as saying that this episode isn't intended in any way as a hatchet job on the RAF or their role in the Allied bombing campaign. My grandfather, Jack, was a member of the RAF during World War II. Ultimately, he was captured by the Afrika Korps during the Battle of El Alamein. I have got nothing but respect for the quiet stoicism that he and his fellow airmen fought with, and for the manner in which they conducted themselves at the end of the campaign. But if you look, for example, at the outrage over the recent drone strike in Afghanistan that killed a carload of civilians, and then you try to compare that to the results of the Allied bombing campaign in World War II, the trade-off, it's just insane. Like most British kids, I grew up following a very black and white narrative that the Luftwaffe had carpet bombed London, as per the events shown in movies like the Battle of Britain. In addition to this, because I grew up in the West Midlands, I also had the ruins of Coventry Cathedral, and that just added to a simplistic narrative that the Germans were bad guys and they bombed cities full of innocent, defenceless civilians. Dresden and the wider Allied bombing campaign of World War II, it doesn't seem to be a subject that we talk about much in the UK, and I guess that's hardly surprising when you look at the figures involved. The three successive bombing raids that took place on Dresden over the 13th and 14th of February 1945 killed somewhere in the region of 25,000 men, women, and children. And those deaths were part of a wider campaign that saw 500,000 civilians killed and whole cities effectively wiped off the face of the map. In cities such as Hamburg and Essen, the raids were ultimately seen as justified because there were either military targets there or companies that were directly contributing towards the German war effort. Dresden just didn't fit into that category. It was a historic city, and ironically, at the time of the bombing, it was filled with Allied POWs and hordes of refugees who were just trying to get away from the Red Army. The Allied campaign was pretty ruthlessly conducted by Air Marshal Arthur Harris, Bomber Harris, and he had learnt his trade as a pilot during the Great War and the interwar period, when ideas such as bombing from the air were very much in their infancy. Harris was utterly convinced that if you destroyed a city such as Dresden, you would break the will of the civilian population. They'd turn against their masters, and the war would come to an end quicker. And I mean, you just have to look at the bloody irony of the fact that he was sat in London, a city that had been bombed, and all that had happened was it had united the people in a common stoicism and hatred against their enemy. But Harris was bitter, and he was arrogant, and by force of his personality, he convinced his peers and his subordinates, more importantly Winston Churchill, that he was right. And he wasn't in any way original in his thinking. The idea of totally destroying a city to win a campaign was one that the Germans had come up with. They'd done it in Guernica during the Spanish Civil War, and they'd also done it when they bombed Rotterdam during the invasion of the Netherlands, which again is a story that isn't really spoken about that much. Unsurprisingly, just given the scale of the civilian deaths and the damage, which was just a propaganda gift for the Nazis, there was quite a backlash against the raid. Both Harris and indeed the pilots under his command would be denied certain honours and awards after the war, and Churchill would forever bemoan the fact that he was ever talked into allowing the operation to take place. The raid on Dresden played out pretty much chronologically as I've represented it in the episode. I don't think I've recommended the book before on the channel, but I lifted very heavily from one named Dresden, The Fire and Darkness by Sinclair Mackay, which I used as my primary source. This episode is probably the first I've written that's actually got under my skin. When you read about how 25,000, 30,000 men, women and children who had no way of defending themselves were killed, I don't make any apologies for the more gruesome elements of the bombing raid I've included in the story. They're not made up, they're largely lifted from Mackay's book, and if anything, I've left out some of the more disturbing ones. I would really recommend that you read Mackay's book. It's a tough read, but it is well worth the time. And also, if you are interested in how aerial bombing came around and the history and the evolution of it, there's a book called The First Blitz by Neil Hanson, which documents how the Germans had air superiority over London during World War One and came very close to firebombing the city, but thankfully the war ended quick enough. As with previous stories, I have been a little bit elastic with some of the facts in order to make them fit around my story. The raid timings are a little bit off because I've had to try and fit my events in around them, but the numbers of bombers involved and the damage caused is accurate. I wasn't able to find sufficient detail for what happened to the Semper Synagogue. It was burnt down in 1938. There are some references to the fact that the debris may have been taken away by city authorities, but I couldn't find any images or pictures that worked for that. And it suited me to have some ruins left. So in my version, the Nazis have left the damage there as a visual prompt to the rest of the city. The three main German antagonists are all fictional, but they're all based on real characters from Sinclair Mackay's book. These were real people, military officials, civilian officials, and the bulk of them they survived the raid, tried to escape after the war, and were captured by the Russians. If we're going to go for full disclosure, this is probably the episode that I'm most nervous about in terms of audience reaction. I've tried to shy away from the Holocaust deliberately because it's a polarizing subject. Social media, the mainstream media seem to make their money these days by seizing on posts from disgruntled commentators who are unhappy that characters have been created and presented by creators who aren't from that character's background. So far, I've managed to get away with very little negative feedback to what I've done, and I'm quite eager to try and keep this channel away from any controversy. I was quite apprehensive when I came up with the idea of Johnny Greywolf, how he'd be received. Ultimately, I'm from the West Midlands of England. The only times I've ever been to America was in the state of Florida, and I haven't got any authority or representation to represent the Native American community in stories. Thankfully, I did get some feedback for Greywolf, and it was overwhelmingly positive, and I'm hoping that because I've taken the same approach to Magda, it'll be taken in the same light. I'm not trying to create a Jewish superhero. I'm not trying to make entertainment out of what happened in the Holocaust. But as with all the stories I've written, what I am keen to try and do is to examine the horrors of World War II, the consequences that came out of those horrors. And I guess if I'm flailing around at any point, it's that this is a horror story. There's a monster in it, but maybe he's not the only monster. Speaking of monsters, from what I can tell, the Golem is a fairly underused horror character in the wider genre when you compare him to some of his more international equivalents. As with our take on the Wendigo, myself and Sean have put a little bit of our own spin on the character, and I hope it's as well received by you guys as the Wendigo was. Finally, I was asked a while back what this channel was. Are the individual stories? Is it part of a shared universe? I guess the inclusion of Ernst Kohler from Mendacious, his father, is probably my answer to that. I do plan to have further familial links and associations in future episodes, but I would emphasise that that's more going to be to look at the random and crazy nature of a global war rather than any deeper plot or narrative. I'd really welcome any feedback for this episode in particular. It's the longest one I've produced. I'm not sure if the amount of time balanced against the raid and the horror story are enough. I do worry it might be a bit too gory. So, as ever, let me know how I'm doing. And also, just thank you to your ongoing support, particularly to those of you who've gone over to Patreon and helping to keep things going. Oh, and Merry Christmas.